Good to see you all out with us this morning. Our sick list is getting shorter, but it looks like we've traded some names for some that are now sick that are not with us today, that had been with us. And so we're certainly mindful of the bugs that are going around. So be careful as you're out and about. Hopefully we can continue to remain healthy and together. Thanks, Mike, for those good songs that he led this morning. And as we bring this lesson, today's lesson is part 2 of 3 of our series that we're doing on worship. And you'll recall from last week, we talked about this verse in particular that we mentioned and will continue to mention throughout this series from John chapter 4, verses 23 and 24. We'll look at that again here, and we'll do a bit of review this morning from last week's lesson, kind of bring us back up to speed of where we are today. John chapter 4, verse 23 and 24, Jesus said, "But the hour is coming, and now is, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth." That's the text that we're going to use for today's lesson, as well as when reviewing last week's lesson, we notice this particular verse. We're looking at that particular verse and looking at these highlighted verses as well, in particular today. And we'll look at those moving forward more. You might recall from last week's lesson, we talked about 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and we were looking at verses 17 through 34, where we noticed that throughout that particular text, 5 different times, this phrase is used differently in certain cases, but basically it's saying, when the church comes together. And so we're talking about, and that's what we're referring to when we talk about worship in that phrase or in that context, that what we're doing here today is hopefully acceptable worship before God. And so we, the church, are together. Now, every single member of the church isn't here. We have some that are sick and some that are on Zoom and that sort of thing. But collectively, the church is together here today. We also noticed in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, where 7 times this phrase is used, the church coming together in one place. And so that's why we were focusing on that phrase and those phrases, referring to us, the church, but we are together worshiping God. We're together in one place, you might say, worshiping in one place. We talked about that in some detail last week, and really what we're trying to do is we're trying to show a difference in between what an individual Christian does and what the church does collectively. And that's what we're trying to refer to here when we referred to that last week and what we referred to that this week as well. This is collective worship. And as an individual, we do certain things also. But there's a difference between what I do as an individual and what the church does collectively. For an example, we'll show some examples of that. I might decide to go over to Arlene's and rake her leaves. Well, that's me, or I might bring some help along with me. Someone to bag while one rakes. You see, that's us doing that between me and Eddie or whoever might go with me. That's individuals doing good things to help others on an individual basis. That isn't to say that that's an action of the church, that we should rake leaves every morning for somebody. You see, collectively, we do things differently than what we might do on an individual basis. Or I might clean Arlene's gutters. I'm sure they're a wreck. All right? We know. Just kidding with Arlene, you know that. But we might have someone hold the ladder while someone climbs the ladder and digs out that goop out of the gutters. These are individual actions that I do on my own free time when I have time to help somebody. Or I might, as we all know, that white stuff's coming. And so somebody's driveway or sidewalk might need shoveled. Is that a collective work of the church? No, it's me or somebody that has a good back out there shoveling snow for somebody on an individual basis. Doesn't make it collective church activity. Even though while I'm doing that, I'm certainly doing a good thing. And I'm doing something that is praiseworthy to God, right? Look at Matthew chapter 5 and verse 16. What am I doing when I rake Arlene's leaves and shovel her driveway? Well, Jesus said in Matthew 5 and verse 16, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and do what? Glorify God or the Father in heaven. My action on an individual basis is certainly glorifying God by my action, but it's not collective worship in one place. Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, we referred to that also last week. I beseech you, or I encourage you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your body a living sacrifice. That's on an individual basis. That's somebody who is making a distinction between my life and what I should be doing as an individual Christian. I'm holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Other versions might even refer to that as worship, but you see, it's a individual sort of thing. So there's a distinction between what the church does collectively and what I do as an individual. I may decide to start a business, and I may decide to start a car wash, whereby every fifth car comes through, gets a freebie. And I say some kind of a phrase that might say, we're praising God today, so you get a free car wash today. Does that make it such that the church can start a car wash? No. It's me as an individual making a distinction between what I do on an individual basis, which should be good things. I should be doing these things, and what the church does as a collective body. The church isn't in the business of washing cars. The church isn't in the business of shoveling snow. But me as an individual should and can do many of those good works. Well, today's lesson this morning, with the time that I have remaining with you, is I want to take our verse from John chapter 4, and I want to look at 4 different worshipers of God in that particular verse and see how that verse breaks down by 4 different kind of types of people who might worship God in that sense. We're looking at worshiper of God number 1. That verse talks about that we should worship in spirit and in truth. That word spirit refers to sincerity of heart or passion, you might say. And the truth, of course, is truth found from God's word. Well, we have worshiper number 1, and this person doesn't worship in sincerity or truth. He's doing his own thing. He decides that he wants to worship God any old way he wants to and call it worship before God. Well, that's exactly what the Pharisees were doing. The Pharisees would worship God their own way, however they wanted to, and expect that to be acceptable before God. Well, look what Jesus says in that context. In Matthew chapter 15 and verse 7, he calls them hypocrites. Why would he call them hypocrites? Well, they're proposing to do something, and really, they don't have the first inkling of trying to do anything right. They're not trying to do it in spirit or in truth. They're doing it just simply to be seen by men. Jesus calls them out on it and calls them hypocrites. He says, well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, these people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but here's the problem. Their heart is far from me. That's not in spirit. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrine the commandments of men. That's not in truth. They weren't worshiping in spirit or in truth, either one. Well, that's certainly what we're talking about here. And Jesus is chastising them for that. And these guys weren't worshiping either way properly. They weren't worshiping in sincerity or in truth, either one. They were simply doing it to be seen by men. Well, that's not worshiping in spirit or in truth, or either one. So that's one way you can worship today, which would be like the Pharisees did, and I hope that you're not, and that we don't. Worshiper number 2. How is this done? Well, worshiper number 2 is the person who worships God with a sincere heart, but it's not according to truth. Now, who does that remind us of? Well, that's exactly what Paul was doing, isn't it? Remember from Acts chapter 22 and verse 3, Paul says, I indeed a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in the city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the scriptures of our father's law, old law, and was zealous toward God as you all are today. But he says in verse 4, but I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women. Paul was sincere in his worship, but it wasn't according to truth. Jesus says, I want you to do this both. I want you to worship me spiritually or in sincerity of heart and in truth. Paul had it half right. He was sincere toward his worship towards God, but it wasn't in truth. He was worshiping and binding people and hauling people into jail and calling that worship to God. Well, it was certainly sincere, but it wasn't in truth. You see, sincerity of heart isn't enough. Otherwise, Paul's worship to God would be perfectly acceptable. Well, we all know that that's not true, that you can't worship God in sincerity of heart, but not truth. Jesus said it this way in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he that does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonderful works or wonders in your name? He says, then I'll declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. That's those that are practicing in sincerity, but not in truth. Sincerity isn't enough. Is your worship to God sincere? That's something that each one of us have to ask ourselves. Am I sincere when I sing songs? Am I sincere when I partake of the Lord's Supper? Or am I thinking about who Cleveland's going to play in a few minutes? Or am I thinking about where we're going to eat lunch? Or am I thinking about some chores that maybe at home I forgot to do? You see, sincerity of heart requires me to focus my heart. And it's focusing our heart upon what is at the time. These things are improper worship. Don't you get it? You see? How about worshiper number 3? Worshiper number 3 is the guy who worships in truth, but not in sincerity. And isn't that sometimes us today? We are worshiping God according to what his scripture tells us to do. We'll look at that more next week in next week's lesson, how we are instructed to do certain things in our collective worship as we come together. And so we're here today. I'm filling a pew, but I'm not doing it with a sincere heart. I might be doing it properly. I might be doing the right things, but am I really worshiping God with a sincere heart? Well, Paul speaks to that question here in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And starting in verse 1, he says, "Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I've become as sounding brass or clanking cymbals," making noise. "And though I have gifts of prophecy and understanding all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I may remove mountains, but do not have love, I'm nothing. And though, wait a minute, I even bestow my goods to feed the poor, I'm a good giver. And though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing." What's Paul saying? Sincerity does matter. I have to worship God in a sincere way. I have to do it in truth also, but I do have to put my all into these things. A popular verse that we use a lot of times when we're thinking about worshiping God is Hebrews chapter 10. We'll look at that here this morning. Notice with me here in verse 23. He says, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works." Our coming together today is for the express purpose of, number one, praising God. But number two, I'm here to stir you up unto love and good works. That's part of my job, not as a preacher, but as your brother in Christ. My job is to encourage you, to praise you, sometimes boot you in the behind, to get you stirred up, to know what we've got to do in order to be acceptable before God. Because verse 25, not forsaking, here we go, the assembly of ourselves together. When we forsake this coming together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, so much more as we see the day approaching. Our coming together in one place is a critical component to our being a Christian. And it's a huge part of our worship to God. When I forsake this coming together, he says, what have I done? I'm beginning to sin willfully, aren't I? For verse 26 says, if we sin willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for my sins. You see, I can forsake this assembly. And when I do that, I can't do what I need to do. I can't be here collectively praising God as I should. I can't partake of the Lord's Supper as I should. I can't encourage you and provoke you to love and good works as I should. I can't sing songs like we've sung today that teach a lesson and that we plead with one another to be purer in heart, O God. Help me to be. You see, that's why we come together in one place as a collective group, as the church, and it's to be with a sincere heart and in truth. Well, that brings us to worshiper number 4. And this is the worshiper that Jesus is referring to here in his verse in John chapter 4. This is the worshiper of God who worships sincerely and in truth. And that's the person like we must be today. Have you ever worshiped God with an insincere heart? I have. I hate to admit it to you. It's true. I have sat there and thought about everything except what I should have been thinking about. I have sat there and filled a pew and become a worshiper of God, but wasn't in sincerity of heart. It wasn't in spirit at all. Have I ever worshiped God not in truth? Probably. When I don't recognize the Lord's Supper as what it is, that's not in truth. There are others that have abused, and we'll talk about that more next week, how they have abused the partaking of the Lord's Supper to make it something that it wasn't. That, when we do that, makes my worship not according to truth. Well, this fourth worshiper is one that Jesus is referring to. Our worship to God must be in sincerity of our heart and according to truth. Look what Ezra chapter 7 and verse 10 says. For Ezra had it right, has prepared his heart to seek the Lord and to do it. Ezra wanted to worship God in the right heart and in the right way. He sought the Lord, and he sought the law of the Lord and decided to do it the right way. Do we take our attitude toward worshiping God like that? We're searching God's law to try to find the proper way to do it. Certainly important. But also we're searching our hearts so that we know that when we do worship God, it's appropriate, and I'm focused on what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. In Romans chapter 6 and verse 17, the church at Rome got it too. For God be thanked that though you were slaves of sin, you have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine that you were delivered. They recognized that I needed to change my heart about how I'm worshiping God, and they recognized that I found that form of doctrine in which I needed to do it in. They were worshiping in sincere spirit and truth, sincerity of heart and properly. This worshiper of God is one as in Acts chapter 10 and verse 35. But in every nation, whoever fears him, that's those that have it working it in spirit and in truth, and works righteousness is accepted by him. The right kind of heart and the right kind of way is the spirit and the truth. Those are those who will be accepted before Jesus. Well, today, which one of the four worshipers are you today? Are you the one that is number one he wasn't sincere in heart and he couldn't really care less whether he was doing it right or not? Is that you today? Or maybe you're like number two, who was sincere in what he was doing, but didn't really have a clue whether it was right or not. Didn't really care. Or maybe you're like number three, who you do it in truth, but not sincerity. I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do. I'm sitting here, I'm listening to this guy ramble for a half hour. I sang my song. I shot the juice. I hit the bread. Leave me alone. Is that you today? In truth, but not in sincerity of heart. Or are you one, number four, who is worshiping today with a sincere heart, and you sought out his word to find out what it was that he wants us to do. Folks, that's what we're trying to strive for here. We're trying to create within this congregation a group of people who want to worship God properly. And that requires us to worship in sincerity of heart, that is the Spirit, and to do it right, that's in truth. If you're here this morning and not a member of the Lord's church here, you are certainly encouraged today to become a member of the Lord's church today. I hope these lessons are beneficial to us. And next week, I'll try to wrap this up on our third lesson of this. But this is so critically important for us to recognize that worship to God matters. It matters how I act. It matters what I do. It matters, my attitude toward it matters. And these are the facts that we're trying to build upon to create this series of lessons. I hope these lessons are beneficial. Maybe you're here this morning and you're saying to yourself, I'm like that guy that I'm just not I'm nowhere near this. I'm not doing it properly, and I'm not doing it with my right heart, and I don't even know that I'm doing it right. Maybe you need to have some prayers on your behalf in that regard. Let us help you in that way. If you're here this morning and you need to respond to the call, won't you do so as we stand and as we sing?